It was generally conceded in the village of Little Berwick that Mrs. Thoresby's passion for the occult had at last carried her too far. Whether it was the unfinished séance, the infernal draught in the drawing-room chimney, or merely her tendency to sit up after midnight with foreign cigarettes and French novels, opinions differed. What was not in doubt, however, was that Mrs. Thoresby was found one chilly March morning in the library of Hallington Grange, her body supine upon the Axminster carpet, eyes wide open in what the local physician tactfully called a profound astonishment. The physician, Dr. Pottle, had ventured the more prosaic explanation of heart failure, but the expression upon the lady's face suggested a more complicated conclusion, if indeed she had concluded anything at all. A fallen crystal ball lay smashed upon the hearthrug, and the long curtains flapped softly in the draught from a window curiously left unlatched. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had arrived on the early train for a spot of fishing with the rector, surveyed the scene with that air of cheerful irrelevance which so exasperated officials. "My dear Inspector Moffat," he observed, stooping to retrieve a splinter of glass and holding it to the light with academic relish, "do you suppose the lady was attempting to rejoin Cleopatra or only Madame Blavatsky? I ask merely because the angle of this fragment suggests she dropped it in a fright, not in a swoon. Of course, if she had intended to collapse gracefully, she would hardly have chosen the hearthrug, very inferior upholstery for a final appearance." Inspector Moffat, a man afflicted with a neck 2 sizes too large for his collar, shifted uneasily. "There's nothing in it, my lord. Natural causes, I should say. The poor woman wasn't young." "True," said Wimsey, "but then neither was Methuselah, and he managed without the assistance of crystal spheres. Tell me, doesn't it strike you as faintly peculiar that a lady of Mrs. Thoresby's fastidious habits should leave her window open on such a draughty night? It seems almost theatrical." "Ah, but I forget. This is the country. Theatricality is a capital offense here, is it not?" The inspector, not for the first time, had the uncomfortable sensation that Lord Peter was laughing at him, though no audible sound issued. He muttered something about not jumping to conclusions. Wimsey smiled pleasantly, adjusted his monocle, and added, "By all means, don't jump. Walking is far healthier. But permit me one small liberty. If this was heart failure, it was of a most accommodating sort. It managed to time itself conveniently between the striking of the half-past midnight bell at St. Leonard's and the dairymaid's discovery at 6 o'clock. One might almost suspect the poor lady of consulting the parish clock before expiring." He turned his attention to the broken glass again. "A pity," he murmured. "One cannot interrogate a crystal ball, though I dare say Mrs. Thoresby believed otherwise. Still, I fancy we may yet persuade the living to be as informative as the dead, provided, of course, they can be made to talk." And with that, Wimsey rang for the butler. The butler, a funereal figure with hollow cheeks and a gait that suggested he had been born in black broadcloth, entered with the discreet solemnity of a man attending his own wake. Wimsey, whose eyes twinkled with indecent curiosity, greeted him as though he were an old friend encountered in an unexpected place. "Ah, Baines, is it not? A name worthy of Trollope. Tell me, who discovered your late mistress this morning?" "It was Nellie, my lord," replied the butler, folding his hands with a dignity that implied the dairymaid's existence was a regrettable necessity. "She brought in the morning firewood. I myself was engaged in laying the breakfast table." "And did Nellie scream, or faint, or both? Or is she of the phlegmatic school?" "She screamed, my lord. Most distressing. I myself came at once." Wimsey nodded sympathetically. "Very proper. And when you entered, was the window already unlatched, or was that an innovation of the dairymaids?" "It was as you see it, my lord. Mrs. Thorsby was particular in such matters. She always insisted the room be closed at night. I cannot account for it." "Indeed." Whimsy's tone was light, but his gaze sharpened. "And you locked up last night?" "I did, my lord, as always. Mrs. Thorsby was in the library after dinner. She was still there when I retired at 10:30. I looked in, and she said she would extinguish the lamps herself." "Very independent of her. Did she usually sit up so late, conversing with ghosts and other fashionable acquaintances?" A flicker of disapproval crossed the butler's face. "It was her custom of late, my lord. She entertained certain ideas. None of the household approved." "Difficult for domestic order," murmured Whimsy. "Thank you, Baines. Do send in Nellie, if you please." Nellie appeared, a round-eyed country girl, with a complexion more honest than her curtsy. She clasped her apron as though it were a shield against inquiry. Whimsy, perching lightly upon the arm of a chair, regarded her with friendly interest. "You had quite a shock this morning, Nellie?" "Yes, my lord," she stammered. "She were lying so still like." "And the window, had you ever known it left open before?" "No, my lord. Mrs. Thorsby, she always told me I'd catch my death if I left a crack in the winder. She said the spirits came through drafts. She was particular." "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "spirits and drafts. A natural alliance." He paused, then asked, "Tell me, Nellie, was there any sound in the night? Doors closing, footsteps, a bell, perhaps?" The girl's brow wrinkled. "Now you speak of it, my lord, I thought I heard the big hall clock strike wrong. I was sure it were past midnight, but it struck only 11. Whimsy's monocle gleamed. "A curious lapse. Thank you, Nellie, that will do." When she had gone, Inspector Moffat muttered, "Country clocks are always a bit off, my lord." "Possibly," said Whimsy cheerfully, "but they rarely strike 11 after 12, unless of course someone interferes. One might almost think Mrs. Thorsby wished to confuse the hour of her own decease, which would be considerate of her if she were still in a position to manage it." He wandered to the mantelpiece, examining the fragments of crystal. "We mustn't be hasty, Inspector. Let us see what the others of the household can tell us. Patterns emerge only when one weaves the dullest threads." And so, with a delicate air of amusement, Whimsy prepared to unravel the polite fabric of Hallington Grange, beginning with its most reluctant seams. The next to present himself was Mr. Cyril Thorsby, nephew to the deceased and the sole male relation in residence. He was a tall, raw-boned young man, of the sort who always looks slightly unfinished, as though nature had been interrupted in the act of molding him. He greeted Whimsy with an air of defiance rather too robust for the occasion. "I hope," he began stiffly, "that this absurd fuss will not delay the inquest. My aunt had a weak heart, everybody knew it. There can be no question of foul play." Whimsy smiled amiably. "Ah, but you see, everybody knowing a thing is precisely what makes one doubt it. Too unanimous an opinion is like a too perfect alibi. It begs to be contradicted. Sit down, Mr. Thorsby. You were fond of your aunt?" "I respected her," said Cyril, with the pained air of one correcting a solecism. "We were not intimate." "Respect," murmured Whimsy, "is a chilly substitute for affection, though infinitely more respectable." "And you spent the evening?" "In the billiard room," Cyril replied promptly, "with Miss Carstone and Colonel Havel. We played until nearly midnight." "Capital," said Whimsy. "And you went up to bed?" "A little after. I never so much as looked into the library." Inspector Moffat, who had been listening with satisfaction, interjected, "You see, my lord? Clear as day. Plenty of witnesses to his movements." Whimsy tilted his head. "Indeed, Inspector. Yet one is always curious to know why the nephew, so scrupulous about respect, has lately been pressing his aunt for an advance upon his expectations. A mere trifle of a gambling debt, I fancy." Cyril flushed violently. "That's a damned lie. I beg your pardon, Inspector. But it's an exaggeration. I had some temporary difficulties. My aunt refused to help. It was nothing to do with her death." "My dear sir," said Whimsy, "few things are more directly connected with death than money. Even Street Paul admitted the wages of sin was death, and he was in excellent standing with the church." The young man rose angrily. "If you mean to accuse me—" "Accuse?" Whimsy looked astonished. "Not at all. I merely collect scraps of information like a magpie. One never knows which will prove shiny." When Cyril had stalked out, Colonel Havel appeared, a florid, loud-breathing veteran with the voice of a trumpet and the digestion of a small cannon. He was emphatic that Cyril could not have left the billiard room without his knowledge. "Played a devilish bad game, too," added the colonel. "Kept glancing at the clock as though he expected the roof to fall in, but never stirred from the room until the 12:30 chime." "Ah," said Whimsy thoughtfully, "another testimony to the clock. Remarkable how much punctuality one finds in the country, if not in the timepieces, at least in the witnesses." Inspector Moffat, beaming, declared the matter clear. The nephew had a motive, a quarrel, and no alibi beyond two companions easily deceived. "Precisely," Whimsy agreed blandly. "An open and shut case, which is why I find it so irresistible. Nothing so dangerous as a case that shuts too easily, Inspector. One is apt to discover later that it was only a box without a bottom." He adjusted his monocle and strolled back to the broken crystal. "And meanwhile, I wonder why a lady devoted to draughtless evenings chose on her final night to invite the wind indoors. Do you suppose she hoped to let something out, or something in?" The inspector looked baffled. Whimsy looked amused. Somewhere in the house, the clock began to strike. Slow, deliberate, and, Whimsy noted, half a minute late. Lord Peter remained in the library after the inspector had bustled off to secure statements. He stood a long while gazing at the curtain hem, which stirred faintly with the draught. Then, with the air of a man indulging a private joke, he knelt to examine the carpet near the window. His white-gloved finger traced a curious impression on the Axminster pile. When Baines returned with a tray of tea, Whimsy straightened up with the guilty expression of a schoolboy caught in the jam cupboard. "Capital, you've brought the strong sort, I hope. Murder is a thirsty business. Baines, has the carpet always borne this pleasing dent? Looks as though a chair had been pushed close to the window." The butler hesitated. "Not in my time, my lord. Mrs. Thorsby disliked furniture standing out of place. She was fastidious." "Exactly," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Fastidious people are the very deuce to murder. They notice trifles. Speaking of trifles, do you happen to know whether her ladyship wound the hall clock herself?" "The clock, my lord? No, indeed. That was always my duty." "Ah, and you wound it yesterday evening?" "Yes, my lord, at 9:30. "Excellent. I do adore a conscientious servant, though it puzzles me why the clock persists in striking 11 when it should be 12. Some little mechanical hiccup, perhaps." The butler spread his hands. "I cannot account for it, my lord." "Neither can I," said Whimsy with evident enjoyment. "But we shall discover whether the hiccup is mechanical or human. By the way, what became of the key to this window?" "It is usually kept in the drawer of that bureau." "Shall I look?" "Please." The drawer was opened. Empty. Whimsy's eyebrows lifted, though he said nothing. He sipped his tea as if the absence of the key were the most natural thing in the world. Later, as Miss Carstone was brought in, a thin, sharp-featured companion of Mrs. Thorsby's, with the tight lips of a woman whose chief exercise was disapproval, Whimsy adopted his most amiable manner. "My dear Miss Carstone, forgive me. One always intrudes horribly at such times. But tell me, Did you happen to notice whether the curtains were drawn last night?" She blinked. "Drawn, Lord Peter, of course. Mrs. Thorsby was particular. She said moonlight injured the complexion." "And you accompanied her after dinner?" "Yes. We read aloud for an hour, Swedenborg, if you must know. At a little after 10, she said she would continue alone, and I retired." "And you are certain the curtains were closed then?" "Positive." "Then we must conclude," said Wimsey with a look of innocent delight, "that the draft came in not through negligence, but through design. How very accommodating of it." Miss Carstone bristled. "You imply something unnatural." "Not unnatural, madam, merely human. The unnatural is far easier to credit than the merely human, which is why people prefer to suspect ghosts. But ghosts do not meddle with locks and curtains, not unless they've taken a correspondence course in burglary." When she had swept out, Wimsey made a leisurely circuit of the room, fingering the spines of books, testing the handles of the chairs, and pausing finally before the fireplace. He bent, picked up a small scrap of ash from the grate, and smiled. "A pity," he murmured. "One burns letters in such a hurry." But the paper was thick, the sort used for correspondence. Mrs. Thorsby had a secret, Inspector. She was trying to destroy it. Before or after her death remains to be seen. Inspector Moffat, already half persuaded by the nephew's guilt, frowned. "You make it sound more like murder every minute, my lord." "Oh, no," said Wimsey, setting his monocle firmly in place. "I make it sound like a puzzle. Whether the solution is tragic or merely ridiculous, that, my dear Inspector, we have yet to see. In the meantime, let us test the chronology. Clocks and curtains, doors and drafts, those dull little items that no one notices, they are the very foundation of murder." The afternoon light slanted across the lawns of Hallington Grange, throwing the library into a pale, wintry glow. Wimsey had commandeered the long table for what he called a little exercise in domestic. Mathematics spread before him were a pocket watch, a notebook covered in his spidery hand, and the inspector's laboriously written depositions. "Now, Moffat," he began with that infuriating cheeriness, "let us rehearse the movements of our dramatis persona as though we were stage managing Hamlet. Everyone claims to know their cues, but I have observed that country house tragedies are generally performed with a good deal of improvisation." The inspector, who had been hoping for tea and peace, groaned but complied. "Very well, my lord. At 10 o'clock Miss Carstone retires, leaving Mrs. Thorsby in the library. At 10:30 the butler closes up and goes to bed. The colonel, Miss Carstone again, and Mr. Cyril Thorsby play billiards till after midnight. At 6 this morning the dairymaid finds the body." "And in the meantime," said Wimsey, "the hall clock obligingly struck 11 at the hour of 12. Curious." The inspector frowned. "Country clocks are often out of order." "True, but why did Nellie, who swears she heard the clock strike, insist it was past midnight? She was not consulting a wristwatch, I take it?" "No, my lord." "Then we must assume she judged the hour by the sounds of the house. A girl who rises at dawn to milk cows knows the difference between 11 and 12. Clocks may lie, ears rarely do." Wimsey noted something in his book, then rose suddenly. "Come, Inspector, let us pace out the distance between the billiard room and the library. I fancy it is not quite as far as our witnesses would have us believe." The two men walked the corridor, Wimsey counting paces with deliberate precision. At the library door, he halted. 47 steps, Moffat. Even at a leisurely saunter, one could be there and back in under 5 minutes. And tell me, did you notice the rug by the window? A chair has been dragged there recently. Our colonel swears Cyril never left the game, yet the carpet says otherwise. Inspector Moffat muttered. "You can't hang a man on the evidence of a carpet." "No, indeed," said Wimsey, smiling. "But one can often trip him up with it. And now the question of sound. If Mrs. Thorsby fell or was helped to fall upon that Axminster rug, would anyone in the billiard room hear? They tested it. Whimsy let a heavy folio drop in the library while Moffat lingered by the billiard room door. The inspector returned, looking perplexed. Not a sound, my lord. Precisely. The thick carpet, the closed curtains, excellent for muffling the noise of a body collapsing. Our murderer, if murderer there be, chose the library well. They returned to the table where Whimsy spread the depositions like a conjurer arranging cards. Consider, Moffat, the butler retires at 10:30. Miss Carstone a few minutes later. The billiards last till 12. Between those hours, Mrs. Thorsby is alone, so we are told. Yet the clock's eccentricity, the missing window key, and the scrap of burnt correspondence all suggest that she had a visitor, someone who wished the world to believe her death occurred later than it did. The inspector's eyes widened. You mean she may have died before midnight? Exactly, perhaps as early as 10:30, which would put our dutiful nephew in a most awkward position, would it not? For his alibi depends entirely upon being in the billiard room after midnight. Before that, well, he had ample opportunity to make a brief excursion. Moffat rubbed his neck uneasily. But the colonel swore— Ah, interrupted Whimsy. The colonel swore about the game. But did he swear that Cyril was never absent for 5 minutes? Memory is a curious thing. We remember scores, not silences. He tapped the notebook with a long finger. We must ask again, very gently. And in the meantime, I should like to know why a woman obsessed with drafts risked an open window on a bitter night. She may have been dead when it was opened, or very much alive, welcoming a guest she did not mean the servants to hear. Whimsy closed the notebook with a snap. My dear Moffat, our little play is far from its last act, but the stage directions are beginning to look most intriguing. The next morning broke sullen and gray, the kind of March day that seemed to sulk at being neither winter nor spring. Whimsy, impervious to such moods, was already ensconced in the rector's study, leafing through a pile of correspondence with the unabashed curiosity of a man reading other people's mail. The rector, a mild little clergyman with spectacles that constantly slid down his nose, looked rather scandalized. My dear Lord Peter, I hardly know whether I ought to allow this. These are Mrs. Thorsby's private papers. Exactly why they are worth reading, replied Whimsy cheerfully. If she had wished them to remain private, she should have taken the sensible precaution of dying testate and tidy. As it is, we must consider whether the dead lady's passion for Swedenborg was entirely theological. See here, an account from a London bookseller, for works on reincarnation, clairvoyance, and, most intriguing of all, mesmerism. The rector blinked. Surely harmless enough? My dear sir, so is chess until one is checkmated. And here, observe this little bundle of letters, addressed in a hand distinctly masculine, though thin and rather tremulous, sent from an address in Bloomsbury. Shall we take a peep? Without waiting for assent, Whimsy untied the ribbon and scanned the first sheet. His eyebrows went up. Ah, dearest Constance, you must not speak of the past before the others. They would not understand. Remember, our secret is everything. If we are discovered, both our reputations will be ruined. How delightfully compromising. I wonder who our anonymous epistolar may be. The rector coughed. Constance was Mrs. Thorsby's Christian name, but surely my lord, you don't suspect anything unseemly. Unseemly is the church's word for interesting, Rector. These letters are dated 20 years ago, yet the handwriting shows increasing weakness. Our correspondent was aging, perhaps ailing. Observe the last. Written only a fortnight past. He speaks of a final meeting at Hallington Grange. The rector looked distressed. Then he was here? Very probably, and unless I am much mistaken, He may have been here on the night in question. Whimsy replaced the letters delicately. A double life, you see. To the village, Mrs. Thorsby was the eccentric widow dabbling in spirits, but beneath the incense and crystal balls, a very human flame burned still. She had a lover, or at the very least, a devoted confidant, and people will risk a surprising amount to keep a secret 20 years old from becoming public. Later that day, Inspector Moffat, summoned reluctantly to the rector's study, read the letters with a deepening scowl. "Blackmail, perhaps," he muttered, "if someone got hold of these—" "Not blackmail," interrupted Whimsy softly. "At least, not primarily. More likely devotion or jealousy. Consider, Moffat, Mrs. Thorsby alone in her library, a visitor admitted secretly through the garden window. A quarrel, perhaps, about revealing the truth, about money, about inheritance. The draft from the window explains itself. So does the missing key." Moffat frowned. "But why should the visitor tamper with the clock?" "To confuse the chronology, naturally. If the rector's housemaid saw a shadow slipping away near 11, she must be persuaded she had misjudged the hour. A wrong chime is worth a dozen alibis. My dear Inspector, we are in the presence of a criminal intelligence of quite respectable caliber." That afternoon, Whimsy contrived to interview Miss Carstone once more. She was icily composed, though her eyes flickered when Whimsy laid the letters gently on the table. "You recognize the handwriting, perhaps?" he inquired innocently, her lips compressed. "It is Mr. Hubert Marsh, a cousin by marriage. Mrs. Thorsby always corresponded with him. I never approved." "And did you expect him here, say, a fortnight ago?" "I had heard rumors. He fancied himself a mystic, though in truth he was a selfish invalid. I dare say he encouraged her foolishness." "Was he here on the night she died?" Miss Carstone hesitated for one fraction of a second too long. "Certainly not. I should have seen him." Whimsy smiled gently. "Spoken like a guardian angel, yet one wonders why the angel trembles." He let the silence stretch until Miss Carstone rose abruptly, declaring she had duties to attend. Whimsy watched her go with amused serenity. To conceal a romance at 50 is more laborious than to conceal one at 20, he murmured. One grows so dreadfully tidy in one's habits. And the tidier the habit, the more obvious the disarrangement. He returned to the library where the draft stirred the curtains once more. The window latch had been hastily mended that morning. Whimsy touched it and his smile grew sharper. Very tidy indeed. Almost too tidy. The following day, Whimsy suggested a small conference in the library with Inspector Moffat, Baines the butler, and Nellie the dairymaid. His manner was one of idle sociability, as though they were gathered for charades rather than a discussion of sudden death. "Now, my friends," he began, lounging gracefully in Mrs. Thorsby's armchair, "we must revisit one or two trifles. Murder, if murder it be, is a domestic art, and no art flourishes without attention to detail. Let us talk, for example, of windows." Nellie flushed under the monocle's genial scrutiny. "I told you, my lord, the window were open when I came in." "Quite so, Nellie, and you were very precise. But precision has a curious way of being either exactly right or exactly rehearsed. Tell me, did you notice aught unusual on the sill?" The girl frowned. "There was a smudge, like. I thought it dirt." Whimsy leaned forward. "A smudge, eh? Not the print of a boot, by chance?" She looked startled. "Well, it were shaped a bit queer. I scrubbed it off after." "Ah, admirable zeal. Alas, enthusiasm is the enemy of evidence. Still, we must be grateful for your memory." He turned to Baines. "You heard nothing in the night?" "No, my lord, I sleep heavily." "And yet, was it not your duty to see that all windows were fastened?" The butler hesitated. "It was, my lord. I fastened them all. I cannot account for this one." "Cannot or dare not," murmured Whimsy, though not unkindly. "You see, Inspector, the window must have been unlocked from within, unless Mrs. Thorsby, so fearful of draughts, suddenly took a violent fancy for fresh air. She admitted a visitor." The inspector grunted. "But who?" "Not the nephew. He was in the billiard room." "Ah, yes," said Whimsy, "the billiard room, a place curiously elastic in its definition of presence. Tell me, Colonel Havel," for the colonel had just arrived, summoned with a tactful note, "do you recall every minute of that evening's play?" The colonel blustered. "Perfectly, my lord. Thorsby played like a schoolboy. I remember scoring 2 cannons in a row while he chalked his cue." "And while he chalked his cue, did you by chance look at him?" The colonel faltered. "Well, no. But he must have been there. His turn came round, and he took it." Whimsy's voice was soft. "And yet a clever young man might contrive to absent himself for 5 minutes between turns, leaving his companions none the wiser." Inspector Moffat stiffened. "That's supposition, my lord." "True, and I dislike supposition intensely, which is why we must add another small fact to our collection. Consider this scrap of ash. From The Great." He held it up delicately in a pair of tweezers. "Paper, thick, cream-laid. Nellie, did Mrs. Thorsby ever burn letters in the library fire?" "No, my lord. She kept all her papers neat in the bureau." "Exactly. Therefore, what we have here is not the lady's own hand, but the destruction of some others. And since the bureau key remains in Miss Carstone's possession, one must conclude that a visitor brought the paper and burned it." Inspector Moffat's eyes lit up. "You think the visitor was this Marsh fellow?" "Possibly, but I fancy our Mr. Marsh was too frail for nocturnal adventures. Yet the ash is recent and the window latch recently tampered with. The combination smells strongly of someone younger and desperate." He laid the ash carefully back upon the tray. "There is a pattern forming, Inspector. The wrong chime of the clock, the smudge on the sill, the burned letter, and a billiard player who may not have played as continuously as claimed. A pattern, I venture to suggest, that will look remarkably different in the full light of day." The colonel coughed uneasily. "You mean—" "I mean," said Whimsy, rising with cheerful finality, "that I shall contrive a small experiment this evening. If I am wrong, we shall waste only an hour. If I am right, well, we may find that the dead are less silent than we thought." Night had settled over Hallington Grange with a soft, inescapable quiet, broken only by the ticking of clocks and the occasional distant bark of a restless hound. Lord Peter Whimsy, donning a dressing gown of soft blue silk and armed with nothing more than a pocket watch and a pair of pince-nez, slipped quietly into the library under cover of the moonlight filtering through the closed curtains. Inspector Moffat followed, blinking uncertainly. "Are you sure this is necessary, my lord? The whole house abuzz with suspicion. Will your midnight vigil do any good?" Whimsy smiled with the indulgent patience of a man explaining chess to a child. "Patience, Inspector. The stage must be set before the play begins. Observe and learn." They took their places, the inspector near the door, Whimsy crouched by the hearth, eyes fixed upon the window and the curious dent in the carpet. The ancient hall clock chimed 11. Slow and deliberate as usual, Whimsy's gaze flicked to his watch. It was precisely the wrong hour. Minutes passed, marked only by the quiet breath of the night. Then, barely perceptible, came the faint sound of a latch moving. Whimsy's eyes sharpened. He rose slowly and moved toward the window. A shadow slipped through the open casement, slim, cautious, yet determined. The figure moved silently to the hearth and paused. As though searching, Whimsy stepped forward, clearing his throat lightly. "Mr. Cyril Thorsby, I presume." The young man started, then straightened, caught. "Lord Peter, I was coming to see if you needed anything. I couldn't sleep." Indeed. And did you find your way here by the front door, or a more theatrical entrance? Whimsy's smile was faint but unmistakable. Cyril faltered, then admitted, "Through the window. I needed to speak with my aunt alone. There was something urgent." "Urgent, eh? And you chose to creep in past 11 despite your declared presence in the billiard room at that hour?" Cyril's face paled. There was a quarrel. About the money. I thought it might be the last chance to make peace." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, if you had come before 11, your companions would have noticed your absence, hence the slow chime." The inspector joined them, rubbing his hands. "So the clock was tampered with to cover your tracks?" "Exactly so," said Whimsy. "Our nephew is not only desperate but clever." Cyril sagged, defeated. "Yes, I wanted money," I argued. "She refused. I left, but when I came back, she was gone." "Gone?" said Whimsy. "Perhaps not as peacefully as we thought, but there is one more piece to this drama." He pulled from his pocket a folded sheet of paper, the same thick, cream-laid stationery found in the ashes. "Your aunt burned a letter, Cyril." A letter from the mysterious Mr. Marsh, no doubt. One that threatened to expose not only her secret, but your interests as well. Cyril's eyes flickered with shame and fear. "I never meant for any of this." "Few do," said Whimsy with a faint shrug, "and yet here we are." The dawn began to stain the horizon pink, and the library seemed less a scene of tragedy than a stage cleared after the final act. Inspector Moffat clapped Cyril on the shoulder. "You'll come with us now, lad." Whimsy, lighting a cigar, glanced at the departing figure and mused aloud. "Reincarnation is a curious thing, Inspector. One hopes the next life involves fewer windows and better clocks." The library, now awash in the early light of dawn, bore the faint scent of cigar smoke and stale tension. Lord Peter Whimsy, standing with the easy grace of a man who has just laid aside a particularly delicate chess match, addressed the small assembly that had gathered. Inspector Moffat, the rector, Baines, Miss Carstone, and with an air of reluctant humility, Cyril Thorsby. "Gentlefolk, we are presented with a puzzle composed of many pieces, some apparent, others cunningly hidden beneath the surface. The death of Mrs. Constance Thorsby was not the sudden stroke of nature we were led to believe, nor was it the result of some occult intervention, despite certain spirited conjectures." He tapped the mantelpiece near which lay the scrap of burnt correspondence. "This fragment is crucial. It reveals a desperate attempt to suppress a secret, one known to at least two people, the deceased and Mr. Hubert Marsh. The latter, as we have learned, was a somewhat frail but persistent correspondent whose devotion crossed the boundary into obsession." Whimsy turned to Cyril, who shifted uncomfortably. "Your presence at the Grange on that fateful night, entered by means unorthodox, contradicts your stated alibi. The tampering of the clock was a clever stratagem designed to obscure your movements and give the impression of continuous attendance in the billiard room." Cyril's cheeks flushed deeply. "I was desperate. I did not intend harm." Desperation, as the poet tells us, is the mother of invention and occasionally of tragedy. Whimsy resumed, eyes gleaming, but the true cause of Mrs. Thorsby's demise was not the quarrel alone, nor the financial disputes. It was the sudden collapse caused by a weakened heart, exacerbated, let us be frank, by the shock of betrayal. He gestured towards the window, now properly secured. The open window was no invitation to ghosts, but a clandestine route for a visitor. The smudge upon the sill, the missing key, and the dent in the carpet all speak of a hurried departure. "The carpet, sir?" The rector looked puzzled. "An impression made by a chair pushed too close to the window as the visitor sought privacy or escape. It also muffled the sound of a body falling." Inspector Moffat nodded grimly. So it was an accident covered up by fear and rashness? Precisely. Cyril's quarrel agitated his aunt's fragile condition, leading to a fainting or heart failure. His panicked attempts to conceal his visit led to the clock's manipulation and the burnt letters, an ill-considered effort to hide inconvenient truths. Whimsy's gaze swept the room. None of this excuses the deception, but it does render it human. The tragedy lies not in malice, but in misjudgment and fear. He lifted his cigar and smiled faintly. In the end, the only spirits here were those of love, pride, and desperation, eminently earthly and entirely fatal. Cyril's knees sagged as the weight of revelation pressed down upon him. His fingers trembled, twisting the edge of his waistcoat as if to unravel some knot within himself. The room was silent save for the distant crowing of a rooster heralding the approaching day. I never meant to harm her," Cyril stammered, voice breaking. "I wanted only to beg her mercy, to ask for the money she promised. When she refused, I lost control, shouted, 'Yes, but the fall, I swear I didn't push her. She must have collapsed. I was terrified. I thought if anyone found out, I'd lose everything.'" Inspector Moffat's stern gaze softened, but he remained firm. "You should have come clean, lad. Hiding makes you look guilty." Whimsy approached with measured steps, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Desperation distorts judgment. You saw your world unraveling and grasped at shadows. But now the truth is clear and you must face the consequences." Cyril's breath came quicker, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of fleeing, eyes darting toward the door. But the resolve failed him. He sank back into the chair with a defeated sigh. "Confess," Whimsy said quietly, "not because you are a villain, but because you are human. The law, too, recognizes that." There was a long pause. Then, with a tremulous nod, Cyril whispered, "Yes, I'll confess." Miss Carstone, who had been watching silently, turned away, her lips pressed tight. The rector cleared his throat, offering a benediction of sorts on the flawed but repentant soul before him. Whimsy lit a fresh cigar, the ember glowing warmly in the dim room. He mused softly, "We all wear masks, dear friends, some more elaborate than others. Tonight, one mask has fallen, revealing a man who loved badly, feared greatly, and ultimately lost himself." Inspector Moffat gave a low whistle. "You always make it sound like a tragedy, my lord." "Because it is," Whimsy replied, exhaling a lazy curl of smoke, "and because that is where truth often resides, between the comedy and the horror." The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of the drawing room at Hallington Grange, casting delicate patterns upon the polished mahogany and the well-worn volumes lining the shelves. Lord Peter Whimsy, having dispatched the formalities with admirable efficiency, lounged comfortably in an armchair, a faint smile playing about his lips as he surveyed the assembly of still somewhat bewildered household members. "The affairs of the dead," he began, "are often like a well-staged play, where every prop, every curtain twitch, serves a purpose only revealed in the final act. Our late Mrs. Thorsby, it seems, lived as many lives as a seasoned actress, each layered with secrets and half-truths." Miss Carston, standing near the window with the stiff grace of one accustomed to suppressing dissent, nodded with a resigned sigh. "It is a relief, at least, to have the truth, though I confess I shall miss the mystery." Whimsy chuckled softly. "Mysteries, my dear Miss Carstone, are like moths, fluttering about the candlelight of our curiosity, but none so tragic as those caused by human folly. It falls to us to distinguish the flutter from the flame." Inspector Moffat, who had aged a little through the ordeal, offered a grudging smile. "Your lordship's methods may be unorthodox, but I confess they bring results." "Results, yes," Whimsy replied, tapping his pipe against the ashtray with a satisfied air. And sometimes the greatest result is simply the restoration of order, however fragile, in a world prone to disorder. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with my cigar and some Shakespeare. After all, as Polonius so wisely said, "To thine own self be true." With a final arch of his brow and a wink that suggested both mischief and magnanimity, Lord Peter Wimsey rose and took his leave, the gentle rustle of his coat the last whisper of a mystery resolved, yet never quite forgotten.